We're here tonight, as Susie mentioned. The impetus for this event is that it's about a year after the new foreign NGO law was implemented in China. There was also another law in 2016 which was implemented, which was the charity law that governs how domestic NGOs function in China. But there's a lot more going on beyond just the regulatory environment. There's evolving dynamic civil society space in China, and the appetite for charitable giving and philanthropy in China is growing by leaps and bounds. So I think what we're seeing right now is a rapidly evolving sector, a charity sector, a philanthropic sector, and new government policies that are evolving to try to regulate that space in a reasonable manner as it develops. So I was going to ask my first question to you, Tony. You were there in China in the mid-90s, in the early days of the Ford Foundation, and I wanted to know, at that time, when Ford was relatively new in the space, what were your hopes and expectations for international groups working in China, for domestic groups working in China at that time, and how have the last 2 or 3 decades kind of confirmed your expectations, bucked your expectations?
Well, I think when I was lucky to be the representative of the Ford Foundation, there weren't many other organizations working in China. And the whole idea of NGOs, of civil society, social space, social organizations was relatively new. And it was also a time when the Chinese government itself didn't have a lot of money to put into certain areas. So, I think my expectations and hope were that we would be able to help develop a sense of the positive role that non-governmental organizations could play, that it's not in the kind of stereotypical characterization that there's somehow a conflictual relationship, but it actually is a supporting relationship. It does, of course, enable you to reach communities that the government itself can't always reach. With some examples of that were, for example, people living with HIV/AIDS. The government, even if it wanted to, didn't know how to get into contact with them, and those groups of people often wouldn't trust the government. And so non-governmental organizations were able to form that bridge to those kinds of communities. I think the second thing we hoped to do was be able to form bridges and links to an international community that was thinking about challenges of development, about challenges of social justice, challenges of equity. So those maybe were the 2 sort of big areas I had for hopes. In terms of fast forwarding to now, the picture's dramatically different. And I do still think foreign NGOs have a role to play in China, but it is so different from the 1990s or even 10 years ago, where the Chinese government has a lot more money to fund activities. Chinese society has a lot more activities. There's a lot more vibrancy within Chinese society. There's many more Chinese organizations dealing with some of those issues. Now, of course, there are certain things which are off limits around advocacy, mobilization of certain marginalized groups. But there's been a tremendous growth in that community that I think totally changes the landscape for international groups working in China. And perhaps one area which might be a fruitful area to look at is that as China goes outwards, how might its organizations engage in a regional and a global sphere, particularly as Chinese enterprises move abroad, Chinese foundations move abroad. International organizations have a lot more experience than those in China, and those may be areas for learning, compatibility, and maybe collaboration.
That's great. I want to ask one quick follow-up question. You mentioned one of the things that's changed is that Chinese government didn't have a lot of money necessarily in the 90s when you started, and now it does. How does that directly impact maybe what foreign organizations might seek to do in China? What would the role then be if the goal is not to just bring in a bunch of money? What would the new role be?
Yeah, I think it does mean that the Chinese government has been able to reassert the agenda because it can fund many of these activities itself. I think where there is a positive role to play is maybe perhaps related to the comment I made earlier about a kind of bridge to hard-to-reach groups within society. And I do think as the philanthropic sector now expands in China, I do think, not necessarily from the US, I mean, there's different models of philanthropy around the world. As you know, European philanthropy operates quite differently because of tax laws, other things. But I do think there are maybe best practices that can be introduced to work with Chinese colleagues and Chinese partners about how do you organize philanthropy, how do you think about mission, how do you think about grant making, how do you think about transparency, and how do you think about accountability. And I think those are sort of areas which international groups have a lot of experience in, and I think these rapidly developing groups in China could benefit extensively from.
Great. So I want to ask you a similar question, but more from a legal and regulatory perspective, because that's your expertise. So I mentioned both the charity law, which was implemented in 2016, and the foreign NGO law that was implemented at the beginning of 2017. In what ways are those regulations continuations of trends that we've seen over the last 2 decades, and in which ways are they breaks? Which ways do they mark anything fundamentally different from regulation of civil society that we've seen?
Yeah, actually the 2 laws give the legal frame. I mean, the legal frame for the international NGOs and the domestic NGOs, how they can do the fundraising, how they just carry out their activities. So they give the legal frame so they can follow up. And so I think some foreign NGOs and domestic NGOs and foreign NGOs, Chinese partners, they will have more confidence if the foreign NGOs get the registration and domestic NGO get the registration. So their cooperation is according to the file, so it is quite legal. So they feel that is quite comfortable and have more space for them to just continue their current program. But on the other side, we can just feel that for the charity law, actually one of quite important section is to regulate the fundraising, how the charitable organization can do the fundraising, and what kind of the circumstances or the conditions they need to meet to do the fundraising. So, and for the INGO law, actually they regulate what kind of the foreign funding and what kind of the Chinese domestic NGO can obtain from the foreign funding, and what kind of the activities they can use those kind of the foreign funding. So we can feel that at the same time, the domestic NGO, they have the laws to follow to do the fundraising, but at the same time, they have some regulations. They may change their previous cooperation with the foreign funding. They can do the fundraising in mainland of the China, but at the same time, because I know, as Tony mentioned, the NGO actually is the section for China is quite new. It's the new concept. I should say it is no more than 30 years, so it's still in the developing process. And a lot of NGOs, actually, they were established and continued and supported by the foreign funding. But at that time, it is some data show that before the INGO law implemented, it is almost 10,000 foreign NGOs active in China, but no any legal registration or record. But we can feel that a lot of domestic NGOs really work and cooperate with the foreign funding, foreign NGOs. But so far, we can feel that both of these 2 laws, they have their some interest. They encourage the domestic NGO to get the registration, and they have the different types of the organizations the domestic NGO can register with. And also for the international, the NGO law, they focus on, they only allowed the registered office or the temporary activities can cooperate with the limited types of NGOs in China. So which means for some NGOs, they definitely cannot do the fundraising in mainland, and also they cannot get the international support anymore according to the INGO law. So for them, the future or the plan need to be changed, and maybe more difficult for them. Yeah.
So it sounds like for a lot of people, there's a clear regulatory framework that they can work within and have some confidence in. Yeah. But in terms of funding, people may have to rethink how they were getting their money from before. Can you talk a little bit about, in particular, this funding issue? I think is really interesting because there's now, I think it's Tencent that has the 9/9 Charity Day, right, on September 9th now, I think since 2015. And they're raising millions, hundreds of millions, many millions of renminbi. Every year people can go online and donate directly to charities of their choice. And we're seeing more of sort of individual giving and wealthy philanthropists in China giving money. And so I'm wondering how does the new charity law and kind of this new concept of philanthropy or evolving concept of philanthropy, how does the charity law play into people's willingness, ability, desire to give? Does the charity law say anything about that? And what can we expect, I guess, generally in terms of giving, individual giving, corporate giving in China?
From my point of view, I think one of the purposes of the charity law is to solve the problems is the China GDP is growing so fast, and the China sometimes cannot be treated as the real developing country. They are in the middle income country level. And it is not only talk about the government, it is also talk about the private treasure. I mean, the people, individuals have more money, and they would like to do something good, or they would like to do something, contribute back to the society. So I think that is one of the charity law drafted the purpose. So they would like to face those issues happened in the whole society. And so actually they regulated that only the charitable organizations can do the fundraising in the public. So you mentioned that the September 9th day for the whole China actually is through the, we call it the social media. They can just but a lot of, I know, the program, actually they worked with the foundation or association. They really qualified as the charitable association already, which means they, according to the charity law, they already get their legal status as the charitable organization. So, which means those organizations, I mean the foundation and association, charitable organization, they can do the fundraising in the public, and other organizations or even the individual programs, they cooperated with the charitable organization, and they do the fundraising together, but they use the fund in specific project. So I can feel that even, the law actually give more, just as we mentioned, the legal framework for the charitable section to do the fundraising, and so a lot of NGO, grassroots NGO or the individuals, they still find the way to do the fundraising, even they are not the charitable organization.
I think there are a number of factors that were holding back development of the sector. I mean, one was the number of corruption cases which had occurred around giving, charitable giving, particularly with government-organized NGOs, as they're referred to. I think that related to a second question about transparency and related to that accountability. It was very vague how these organizations should be structured and who they're accountable to. And then the last important factor, I think, is that the Communist Party has always been ambivalent about private wealth. Of course, when it took power in 1949, it took private wealth out. And has always since then, despite certain political moves to try and co-opt wealthy people in China, I think there's always been a suspicion about private wealth which is outside of the party or the state's reach and how it might be used, whether it might be used for anti-government purposes or not. But of course, since China entered the WTO, you've seen this massive boom in private wealth in China. And I think those two laws, the charity law and also the foreign NGO law, were really set to try and address those problems. And I think it recognizes, first and foremost, that the Chinese Communist Party has accepted that there is a lot of wealth in society, and that many of those people with that wealth want to give back to society in one way or another. But importantly, allied with that, they want to make sure that it goes to those kinds of areas that the government itself sees as a priority for giving. So what is outlined in the law are certain areas of activity, although it has etc., which is a very important etc. usually in China. It outlines quite clearly those sorts of areas that it wants people to give charitable donations to: health, education, scientific research, the environment, and so forth. So, one, it's a recognition of that money is there in society. Two, that it needs to be regulated more effectively. But three, where the money is given to those areas that the state itself prioritizes as key sectors for investment from society.
So we've talked a little bit about, growth of philanthropy and how the government's changing views on the philanthropic sector have, allowed this evolution to take place. But what about views of civil society, NGOs, charitable giving among Chinese people? I remember for years people told me, well, I don't want to give money because I don't trust who it's going to. There was this, for anybody who doesn't remember, the Red Cross scandal, I think it was in 2009 maybe. Wang Yongmei was a woman who posted many flashy pictures with many flashy cars, and it was made to seem that she was taking Red Cross money to get these fancy cars. And that really had a deleterious effect on the public's views on NGOs and on charitable giving. And as Yongmei mentioned, NGOs is a relatively new concept in China. So I guess we've talked about the government's views changing. How have people's views changed? And what is the relationship between what's going on generally in China in terms of what are people interested in, what are people focused on, what sectors are civil society and grassroots NGOs, how's their focus changed over time?
Shall I start?
Okay. Yeah, actually, I think that is a good question. As for the public, in China, because of the Red Cross Wang Yongmei's event, actually, they lose the face to the governmental background organization. I should say that because in China, a lot of organizations, they registered as a foundation, association, or the private non-enterprise organization, but they really have some government background. So they have more cooperation with the government than the civil society. So actually, I think the public lose the face more to those organizations rather than we call it the grassroots NGO, because the grassroots NGO, for example, the disabled rights or the LGBTR rights or the migrant rights or even the domestic violence, women's issue. So those actually organizations really focus on the individuals or the vulnerable people's interests. And so the people knew this organization, they really care about what they do for this community. So there are some trust. And I think a strong relationship and the strong trust still exists that. So that's the reason why the September 9th day always happened with the WeChat. You know, the WeChat and the Weibo is quite different. WeChat is always, they have their friend and relatives and also even the colleagues, the people you definitely know, or at least you meet once. But for the Weibo, actually, it is just for the public. So actually, the September 9th day, they raise a lot of funding from their friends, from their community, from their relatives. So actually, there are some, I can feel that is the trust. It exists.
Yeah, I think trust is a really important component of that. And I think it's also that, China is much more affluent now. And particularly a lot of young people begin to not only be interested in making money, making wealth, but they also become much more interested in the environment in which they live. Not just the physical environment, but the social environment as well. So in that sense, I think things have dramatically changed. One thing that has always puzzled me a little bit and we've been doing some work on this, is that China in the World Giving Index came out as next to last. I think it was only Burundi, I think, was the only country that was below China. And I don't think that's right, because I see a lot of giving in China, but it doesn't get picked up. I mean, if you go to a temple, if you go to clan organizations, many religious organizations in China, there's a lot of giving, as you say, within the local community where there is trust. Yeah. But of course, in the US, if I were to give to the church, I'd record it as a tax-deductible item. But in China, if you give it to the temple or the local clan association, it doesn't. So those things don't get recorded. So one of the things we're trying to do in the center with our philanthropy program is doing some kind of web scraping to find out how much people are really giving. And, you know, everybody talks about Jack Ma and the big philanthropists, but my gut feeling is there's a lot more giving within society. But as you both said, they don't want to give to these big government-organized NGOs because of the questions around accountability, transparency, and the corruption scandals that came up. After the Wenchuan earthquake, the big earthquake in Sichuan 2008, huge outpouring of giving. And a lot of people don't know what happened to the money. They say, where did it go? I mean, society gave a tremendous amount of money and not quite sure what happened to it.
Do you have any sense that the charity law is going to allow for us to have more insight into this sort of informal giving? Or is that the sort of giving you're talking about, that's not going to be captured by this law?
My personal view, but you might know better, my personal view is I don't think it will be.
Okay.
So what we've tried to do is go through things like, you know, WeChat, other online things to see what people are saying about what they're giving. But, you know, if anybody goes to villages in the Chinese countryside or even different urban communities, you often see that the temple has often become the main site of reciprocity, not necessarily the party office or the government office. You know, people will often go to the temple to sort out problems, to think about, you know, how do you help distressed families within the village? And they often have that local knowledge that helps. And of course, it then revolves around trust relationships, as you rightly said, and often the trust is stronger there. But you don't capture that, I don't think, through the charity law.
Yeah, my opinion is the same. I don't think the charity law will just would like to give some space about those giving. Actually, they would like to. That law would like to, how to say, guide the funding into the directions which the government they think they will benefit for the society. So that is from the government view of the point. So they will just use the regulation to guide the funding to go to the directions they think it is suitable for the society. Not the funding they really would like to, for example, the community would like to really giving the fund to their interested events. I don't think will be just in the charity law, so it is different.
So that raises a really interesting question about the tension between what you guys have described as a really vibrant sort of trust-based, local, grassroots sort of effort, initiative to help your community give back to your community, and people being more willing to give at this very local, personal knowledge level. And at the same time, the government more interested in saying, okay, we want poverty alleviation funds, we want disaster relief funds. So how do those tensions resolve themselves? I mean, do you end up with more groups that are formed locally that just end up doing the sorts of work that government does? Or, I mean, how does this, it seems like there's two slightly different things at play. Or do you think that, you know, the issues that local grassroots groups would want to organize themselves around anyway also do happen to be the exact same sorts of things that the government wants to funnel money to? I know, you know, sure, everybody wants their kids to have good schools, and that's something that the government wants too. Is there a tension there, I guess I'm asking, between what people at the grassroots want to be supporting and between what the government wants to funnel this money towards?
Personally, I don't think there's a tension. I think it's in part a question of scale. I think where the tension comes is if community organizing begins to cross jurisdictional boundaries and, for example, would begin to organize dispossessed farmers or laid-off workers and it wasn't locally based, but tried to think about it in a broader scale. And the parties made it very clear that that is unacceptable to it. And we've all read in the newspapers all the cases of human rights lawyers, labor activists, and so on, who are arrested. So, there are clearly limits to the permissible, which have been pretty clearly drawn. But I think in your specific question, I don't think there's a sort of tension, because I think a lot of that local engagement, as you say, is about getting a better school, maybe getting some kindergarten facilities, maybe getting some kind of better health facility. So on that point, I don't see necessarily a tension.
Yeah, for me, actually, I can feel some intention among the grassroots NGO. Actually, because I usually divided into the grassroots NGO into two types. One is the service-based. So the NGO more focused on provide the service to the community, the elder issue and the children issue and even some health issues. So actually, they were more focused to provide the service to the community. And another type of NGO, in my mind, I always say the advocacy NGO, who more focus on the policy change and to involve into the legislation and by change the law to change the situation about the community. So I think those two types of the NGOs, they definitely have some intention about the funding and about the government support, and especially after the foreign NGO implemented. Because actually, we can feel that the government really would like to support the service-based NGO, because we all know the service is important. We have the huge population. And the government cannot provide all the services to the community and with so details. And they need some professionals. For example, the social workers and the counselors to provide the real professional service to the community. That is really extremely the good thing. But at the same time, the other type of NGO, I mean the advocacy or the policy related change NGO, actually they face the different situation. For the service-based NGO, they can get more funding because actually they can register quite easily and they can do the fundraising in mainland. They can cooperate with the registered foreign NGO and they can get a lot of supported from the government by signing a contract, the government purchase program. So they have more and more space to develop. And also they can attract, because maybe they can provide more salary and a stable career development opportunity. So they also can attract a lot of new generation, I mean the young generation. They would like to just, they have the good heart, they would like to work for the society, they will choose that good organization. But at the same time, we can feel that, we call it that if it has happened continually, and actually the service-based organization will swallow or eat the space of the advocacy NGO, because advocacy NGO, some of them is quite hard to get the registration, and which means they cannot get the funding from the registered foreign NGO, and they cannot get definitely a few or limited government support fund. So they are forced to change their mission to the service-based, or they are forced to change their mission to stop their work. So actually, it is, we call it the NGO, but the charitable NGO, non-profit, and also the public interest is we mixed those kind of the legal concept together, but actually they're not the same thing.
Right. Yeah. Right. So the tension isn't necessarily the sectors or the issue sets you're working on. It's maybe how you're going about working on them. That's the. We've talked about how maybe methods are bifurcated. I wanted to ask a bit more about the the domestic and the international bifurcation. So we have these two laws. One which regulates domestic NGOs, one which regulates foreign NGOs, that very clearly from the government point of view puts these two things in two different baskets. Do you think that that has had or will have an effect on the types of issues and or methods that domestic versus international NGOs will do in China? Do you think that, there's, because of the different set of regulations, maybe domestic NGOs will be more focused on doing XYZ sort of work and foreign NGOs will take on this other work? Or do you think, no, it'll probably basically be the same thing, it's just a different method of registration?
I think that they'll both be working in the similar kinds of areas, but I do think that it's going to be much more difficult for the international groups to work in China with this new process of registration. For those who don't know, an international group first has to find a sponsoring agency, and then once it has a sponsoring agency, it has to register now with the Ministry of Public Security instead of Ministry of Civil Affairs, which was the case previously. And I think one of the problems is, why as a sponsoring agency would you take on responsibility for an international group? Because all it can really mean is trouble for you and problems, and it's probably better, just to either give no reply or do nothing. So I think the terrain will be more difficult for the international NGOs. I do think those, as I think Yongmei and others have pointed out, those who are really trying to work in advocacy areas, I don't think are going to find it as a very conducive atmosphere to work in China. I think that's going to be a similar problem, though, for domestic NGOs, although because they're embedded in the society, it may be easier for them to duck, bob, and weave and kind of find their way around the situation. I mean, as all of you know who work in China, the Chinese are nothing if they're not creative. As soon as there's a regulation, within a few months, everybody's worked out how do you get around it, and what do you do to basically nullify it. So I think I have great faith in their capabilities to find ways around things. What I do think we'll see in the short term, just as a last sentence, is that if we think about the service NGOs as comprising the third sector, I think that's going to expand hugely in China with the social support. If you think about civil society as a place for critical reflection, advocacy, and engagement, I think that's going to be severely constrained in the short term. If we look longer term, I'm not so convinced that that will be the case, because I think if you look longer term out, there's a base now within Chinese society that didn't exist before, of autonomous organization, of NGO organization, and you can't wish that away once it started. You can constrain it, you can push it back, and so that's why I make a distinction, say, between what the title of this was, What to Expect in 2018, which is maybe a little more somber, and what we might see over the longer period of time.
I really agreed with the professor's point of view. Actually, now definitely is not the best time for the NGO to develop, no matter the foreign NGO or the domestic NGO, but I don't think it is the worst time. I'm not sure. But actually, I know, because both of these two laws and some, even the advocacy NGO, they would like to survive, firstly. So they would like to find, just analysis their current work to see whether or not they can just choose one area of their current program to get the registration, and which means they can get more flexibility space to do the fundraising. And also, I know some community, they are not really care about the fundraising from the domestic, the mainland of the China, or they are not fully rely on the international NGO because they have the huge community, and their community have the well education and a well job, and their individuals would like to give the money to the organization to carry on their activities, but not all of such kind of the advocacy organization have those kind of the resource. Right. For the disabled people, they discriminated from the education level, so they don't have the many chance to get the well-paid job. So my point of view is, even those advocacy NGOs, they would like to change a little bit their mission to provide the service to the community. It is not a bad thing, because the more and more service-based NGOs they grow up, they train the new generation and they train the society, and they become more and more professional, no matter the transparency information, and they become more accountable. So it is still quite good for the whole society, the civil society, to develop in the future. Even so far, the law is not so good for the advocacy NGOs, but they still can use the different way to train themselves or to train the new generation. So.
Okay, so it looks like the long-term outlook, we are all pretty feeling pretty good about it. That's great. I'd like to open it up for questions now. And I can't really see, but
yeah.
I'll let someone with a microphone.
Right here.
Okay. Okay, I'll go with the front row then, because that's all I can really see.
You may want to take these lights.
Yeah, if you could take the lights down a little bit, I might be able to see slightly better.
Hello, my name is Larry Bridwell, and I teach international business at Pace University, and I have many students from China. And they're very interested in environmental issues because of the pollution and the like. And so in terms of civil society, whether in terms of advocacy, what is your forecast for the future of the ability of environmental activists in China to function and advocate? And then a second issue is the migrant workers. And I could imagine there might be service organizations that could provide services to low-income migrant workers. But how much advocacy to improve the life circumstances of the migrant workers will the Chinese government allow, not just in 2018, but maybe 5 and 10 years more?
Do you want to answer question by question, or how do you want to do it?
How would you guys like to do it?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think on the environmental issue, the government has to a large extent signaled that as a legitimate area of concern. And if you think about it, it's the one thing which is a fundamental threat to the Chinese Communist Party, because environmental pollution is part and parcel of the development strategy that it chose, whether it's air, whether it's water, soil pollution, or whatever. So it has been in many ways more receptive to both international groups and domestic groups that are working in that area. I would say so, even being more tolerant towards local protests about environmental pollution. Because the trouble with China is, it's also the advantage of China, you can say whatever you like about the place because somewhere it's happening. But if you look at a lot of the localities, there's a lot of examples where local protests have made factories perform better, that have put pressure on government to close down. So that does seem to be an area where the window is somewhat more open than other areas. The challenge of the migrant communities is you have a lot of different interests working against that. National policy has moved on, but a lot of urban dwellers don't want them integrated into the benefits within the urban community. So if I'm a local mayor, I have to weigh up the interests of my community who might not want the migrant kids, or the parents wanting the migrant kids coming to the schools, coming to the hospitals. And so there's been much less of agitation, I would say, around the questions of migrants and migrant rights. But it's not an issue that's going to go away. If you're going to operate a system that is going to, if you claim to be socialist and you claim that you're talking about social equity and justice, it's very difficult to exclude 120 million people from the benefits that others in your country are getting. So the pressure in that sense is not going to go away. I know that's not a real answer to your question, but it's certainly going to be there over the 5 to 10 year span that you're talking about, and government will have to act on it. It has acted, but we'll have to continue acting on it more, I think.
Yeah, and I totally agree with the professors on the first question. I think the environmental issue is very unique issue in China because it is just the common interest between the government and the civil society. They must work together because we share the same air, same water, and same food, and all the same environment. So actually, the central government and the local government, they have their interest to do something. Yeah. So that's the reason why we have the civil procedure law changed that allowed the public interest litigation issued or raised because the environmental issue, pollution. So that is, I think, will be changed because the China government, they are central power, so they can do things quite efficient way. And so I think the environmental issue is quite a unique issue in China now. But for the migrant worker issue, actually I have some very interesting opinion, although I divided into the domestic NGO into the service base and the advocacy base. But I think if the service-based NGO really do their work for long term, they will figure out it is all, they cannot unresourced program related to the policy. If the policy won't be changed, their service is just going round and round but cannot really solve the problems happen to the migrant workers and their children. So actually, if they really do their service job professionally, and they definitely will find it is related to the policy, and they might think about to change the policy, and then it is a part of the advocacy NGO do. So.
Yeah, well, we have a postdoc at our center who's working on protest in China. And one of the interesting things is that, as Yongmei said, and this relates to, say, protests around certain environmental polluting plants, that the party officials in that city and the government officials in that city are adversely affected, as are the citizens. And so they seem much more willing to let the protests go ahead, for example, because they're affected by it as well, and their children are affected by it as well, which is not the case in, say, certain other areas where they might move to crack down more quickly in those areas.
I know I saw a hand up there on the side a very long time ago, right? I think, yes.
Vishaka Desai, Columbia University and President Emerita Asia Society. I have a two-part question. One is that, Yongmei, you talked about advocacy and policy or service. Where do cultural organizations fit in? Mm-hmm. And what is the impact of the new regulation on especially the amount of private cultural institutions that have now come up in China? And the other question is for you, Tony, and that is, you just briefly mentioned that there is some interest in the part of Chinese philanthropy to go global or international. And yet, one of the things I have found is there seem to be tremendous restriction in how the money goes out. Yeah. And so I'd love for you to tell us where that is and how it's playing out.
Could I ask what kind of the culture program you...
Yeah. Like private museums.
Yeah. There are cultural, not-for-profit institutions. I don't mean galleries. I don't mean for-profit. Yeah. But cultural institutions that do think of themselves as not-for-profit institutions.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, I think if it is the normal culture program, it will still be within the scope of the foreign NGO law. So you are allowed to just carry out your program in China. But actually, so far, for my knowledge and experience, I know a lot of culture program, they're related to some minority group of the people. and they lived in some special area, north and west of the China, or even the Tibet, or they have some their special religion, culture, and language. And if the cultural program related to those part of the aspects, it make it more challengeable and difficult. If it is just a normal, I mean the normal museum, the individual show, that is still in the scope of the INGO law. So it is really depend on the content. It is not the name, the title, it's the content. What kind of the organization you would like to support or work with, and which provinces you would like to carry on your program, and what kind of the exhibition or the things you would like to carry on. So it is really dependent.
Yeah, in terms of activities outside of China, you're right, it is quite difficult getting money out of the country. So two of the main areas, of course, is what the Chinese Communist Party calls United Front work, which is donations to things which promote positive messages about China or about the party or whatever. The other growing area, though, is more in the CSR, corporate social responsibility field, where as China is becoming more and more engaged overseas with investments, building factory plants, it is getting involved in local communities with CSR activities. And I think there's a potential for collaborations in those around questions to do with how do you think about local communities when you're setting up plants, enterprises? How do you think about displacement of local workers? How do you think around rights-based issues, which might be easier to do when it's outside of China than perhaps when it's inside of China? But I do think that increasingly that many of the rapidly emerging wealthier groups in China are engaging in global philanthropy projects. We all know about the failed attempts by Bill Gates and so forth to try and get Chinese to join in, which was not a very good exercise if you understood Chinese culture. But there's been various things going on with the East-West philanthropy meetings in Hawaii, and people came there and actually are giving huge amounts of money to things like maritime protection, sustainable development, and giving those monies together with non-Chinese organizations internationally. I don't know how they're getting the money out, to be honest, but they were certainly making large pledges, and I don't think it was just grandeur. I think that it was actually real, that the money was there and that they were engaging in those projects. So, I think it's an interesting area to keep an eye on, and I think it's an interesting area that we shouldn't ignore, because I think it's something where different groups can work together and get a better sort of sense of understanding. And there may be norms and practices which have been developed globally that Chinese organizations could benefit from understanding and beginning to apply.
In the middle there.
Thanks. Ann Sherman. I cover human rights and civil society at the State Department. So you talked about some of the new challenges in terms of restrictions on fundraising and finding a Chinese partner or PSU to register, and in terms of advocacy groups in China. And I wonder, is there a U.S. government role in helping, or a foreign government role generally, in helping foreign and U.S. NGOs that are facing challenges in China, or in working directly with the Chinese government to shape the implementation of the law? Or is a U.S. government role unhelpful, and that this is a space that should be left to civil society?
Well, when I was running Ford Foundation in China, the ambassador was quite clear it was not a very good idea to come near me, the U.S. ambassador. He didn't see it necessarily as helpful. I think at a more serious level, I do think there's a role to play in terms of government-to-government relations, trying to enhance the understanding, to talk about what is the role that NGOs play, and to shift the discussion away from the kind of colored revolution fear and those kinds of issues and questions. And I think there is sometimes issues, of course the US government, like European Union governments, has certain pressures that it has to use certain language about what these organizations do. And that isn't always helpful, I think, in contexts like Russia or in China, because it can lead to misunderstanding or people in the government picking up on the more negative, from their perspective, aspects for it. I'm not sure US engagement on particular instances helped. I'm sure you must have been involved with advice in different forums when the law was being drafted. And that seems to me at that level a very appropriate and a very useful role for the US government to be playing. And, maybe in the way that you work with chambers of commerce to promote what are key issues holding this back that are detrimental to China, that may be the kind of role that the US government could be extremely helpful in kind of culling together, now that we know the law has been there for a little more than a year. What are the obstacles? Are there obstacles? What are the obstacles? What are the blocks? And what might be useful ways to shift that purpose forward? That seems to me to be an entirely legitimate set of discussions for the US government to be involved in. When it gets down to, well, this particular group is having trouble, I'm not sure that would help. I don't really know.
Yeah, I agree with the professor. Actually, I think if it is in the governmental or official level, and you helped the represent or helped all the U.S., the American-based NGO to raise their concern and questions and challenges, for example, the PSU problems to the Chinese government, and to raise the difficulties or problems all the common U.S. NGOs faced, I think that will be, the useful and helpful to raise their attention. But actually, the Chinafile did a wonderful job. We can feel that, according to the data, the U.S.-based NGO is occupied the most quantity of the registered office. So, which means the China government can reply that we really support the U.S.-based NGO already. So, but for the individual organization, they suffered some difficulties to find a suitable PSU, or to just ask the PSU to say yes. I don't think the governmental level negotiation is good.
For those who don't know, the PSU, it's the sponsoring organization that a foreign NGO has to be registered with before it can go to the formal registration with the Public Security Bureau. I do think one thing that perhaps could be useful from the government perspective is to ask the Chinese government why they've made this selection of certain sponsoring agencies, and to try and encourage them to expand the number of organizations that can sponsor international or foreign NGOs, because it's a very restrictive group at the present time. That might be one interesting area to think about.
How about in the blue shirt right there on the right-hand side, the tie,
How can you see the blue shirt?
I can't really see,
My name is Teng Biao. I am a human rights lawyer and scholar from China. In 2003, I co-founded Gongmeng, aka the Open Constitution Initiative, which is very confrontal, focusing on rule of law and human rights. It was shut down in 2009. But since Xi Jinping came to power, Xu Zhiyong, the president of Gongmeng, and many other Gongmeng-related activists were arrested. So I think Xi Jinping is turning China to a more and more Orwellian state where civil society has no place. You can see the roundup of human rights lawyers and activists, the crackdown on underground churches, NGOs, universities, internet, journalists, everything. So especially the confrontational NGOs, of course, service NGOs are very important. But in my opinion, the most important part of civil society is the confrontational NGOs, and I think Xi Jinping will not tolerate any these human rights NGOs, and then even some service NGOs which are confrontational has been shut down. For example, the 丽人图书馆的丽人 Citizen Library program and some others. Yeah, so that's my brief comment.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, that's why I said, I think in the immediate period, civil society, as we would understand it, is going to be severely curtailed. I don't think anybody doubts that. And as you mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, the human rights lawyers and those kinds of groups are going to come under increasing pressure. And I think it's going to be an increasing problem for foreign NGOs that are involved in those areas of advocacy. I think they will not be allowed to be registered and will find it very difficult, if not impossible, to work in China.
Yeah. Actually, we all agree that now is not an easy time or the easy period for the civil society to develop or to move on. But actually, we always make a joke that Internet is the gift from the God to the Chinese people. So which means once you open the door, it's quite hard to close it totally. So we have the Internet, and we have the way to access to the resource. And I would like to share that I think we cannot see the China as a whole. Actually, China is so big and complicated. And the central and the local level, they might have some different conflict interest, or they might have the different opinion about the different NGOs areas. I would like to share the example. Actually, I represent the first case anti-discrimination against the transgender people. Actually, as most of you know, the LGBTI issue is not a legal concept in China law, not so far. We don't give the legal definition about those community. But when we directly talk with the judge, and the judge in the different level, they show their good attitude. They're friendly, they respect to the transgender people, the client. They would like to provide help as possible as they can. So at the same time, we feel that is quite a difficult time. But for the advocacy NGO, and they do the fundraising, but at the same time, the people's mind is changing now. You cannot stop the people's mind. They are changing. They use the information, they use the resource, and after they read more and more, they change their mind. So I know it's not the answer, it's just my...
And with that, we're going to have to call it an evening. And I want to thank everybody again for coming out, and I would like us all to thank our amazing panelists for making it.
Thank you.